First of all, I'd like to say good morning to everybody who has joined us today online, as we've heard from all over the world. It would have been, of course, so much better if we could have gotten together in person in beautiful Crikvenica, especially beautiful for me at this time of the year. But the circumstances have pushed us online. For me, this is the first time that I'm joining Crikvenica International Health Tourism Conference, and I have to say that I have learned a lot about this industry from yesterday's and today's presentations. But one thing that I'd like to emphasize is that what we have learned in our firm and in our industry throughout this year is that pulling together an online event such as this one may be even harder and more demanding than doing it on site. So I would really like to congratulate the organizers, our hosts, for doing it in such a good way. There is one thing that we all depend on in this situation, and that is technology. So we can only hope that the technology, the telecommunications networks will not fail us, and that everything today, in the rest of the day, will go according to the plan. But then I have to ask you a question. When in life do things really go according to the plan? I'd say rarely, and I am sure that many of you would agree with this assessment based on some of your past experiences. I'm not a health expert or a tourism expert or a health tourism expert, but what I have learned in the 25 plus years of experience handling complex situations from the communications management perspective is that there is one thing that all industries have in common. And that one thing is that the crisis will happen. The question is not if will it happen, the question is only when will it happen, when it is going to hit us, and how we will handle that situation. So sooner or later, all industries are faced with major crisis situations. So I've seen this happening over and over again in situations such as union negotiations, strikes, accidents with fatal consequences, bankruptcies of major companies that have spillover effects on whole economies, so on a really large scale. But of course, never before in my professional life have I seen anything like this pandemic crisis situation. So to bring this story closer to your industry, to the health industry, let me share really briefly a real-life situation that we had with one of our clients. This was back in late May this year. So Croatia was still in a lockdown, and the measures were very slowly being released and loosened. And our client is a major privately owned polyclinic in Zagreb. And one Friday morning, we got a call that one of their lab technicians tested positive on COVID-19. And that clinic had for the next day scheduled close to 100 patients from one company coming. They were supposed to come for their yearly checkup. And then, of course, there was this situation with the positive test and the question what to do with the everyday operations and how to survive that situation, knowing that the business is already very damaged and that handling it in an inappropriate way could damage the business even further. So what they did in reality, we'll come back to that at the end of the presentations, and we will see how some of the lessons that I will share with you now actually apply to this situation. So a bit of theory very briefly. So when we get the calls, oh, we have a crisis, there is a crisis situation. Just, you know, first of all, think for a second whether what you are facing really is a crisis situation. So there are a lot of hundreds of different definitions out there on what a crisis situation is. And here I'm sharing with you only one of them. So a crisis is an unexpected and an unpredictable event that threatens our important expectancies and the expectancies of our stakeholders, that can seriously impact our performance, and that very likely will generate negative outcomes to a lesser or a greater extent. If you do not have all these elements in place, then most likely you are not facing a crisis situation. Most likely you are facing just another bump on the road, and you should treat it accordingly. There is no doubt that what the whole world has been experiencing over this past year related to COVID-19 definitely is a crisis situation. It has all the elements that we just mentioned, and it is good to pause for a second and to think about what is probably the most important thing in getting ready for all crisis situations in our lives, and that is, could it have been prevented? Was this preventable? I mean, even though we are talking about unexpected and unpredictable events, what are the things that we can do early on when we are properly recognizing certain issues? And this is, so we are coming to the first lesson that in our firm we have learned over the years. It is not over until it is truly over, and the crisis situation can have more than one peak. Bear with me for a second with this graph. Try to take a look at it. What we have here is what a regular textbook or many different textbooks out there dealing with crisis management and crisis communication management will try to teach you when it comes to crisis. So traditionally, you have this period when an issue is emerging, and you have an opportunity to early identify that issue. If you fail to do that, you will pay for that dearly later on in the process. So then in the crisis, we have this media coverage period, so that the external stakeholders are starting to pick up that something is happening, and all of a sudden we are in the media. Then we have one peak, a crisis outbreak, and then the resolution period that comes right after that. So it looks something like this. And once you reach the resolution period, things start to calm down, and you are slowly going back to normal. But what happens in most major crisis situations, such as this one that we are experiencing today with COVID, is that we do not have one peak. There are many, many peaks, especially when crisis situations extend over a longer period of time. And it is really important that we learn from the previous situations as we are still living through the crisis situation, and that we apply lessons to what is still ahead of us. Where to start when a crisis hits? I'd say that you definitely have to start with internal communications. You have to communicate quickly and effectively to your entire organization, because whatever is happening and however unpleasant it is what you are experiencing, they need to hear it from you. This, even though this is kind of an intuitive lesson, and many people could say to this, yes, but of course that we have to communicate with our people first. What you see in this headline is unfortunately what we are seeing in practice over and over again, that when a crisis situation hits, organizations do not react quickly enough with proper internal communication. Here we have an overseas example of a Maryland motor vehicle administration where their employees learned of a death of a coworker via social media. And when something like that happens, when your internal stakeholders learn of what is happening within your organization through external channels, then you already lost the handle. It is really, really difficult then to get hold of the situation and to be the one in the steering wheel who is actually showing competencies in handling the situation. Because what happens is that the media reports on the crisis whenever they want to, and no matter what you think of it. So you do not have time to get ready for the external questions coming to your organization. This will happen thanks to the social media very, very quickly, and you have to be there in place, ready with your messages for such a situation. Also, going back to something that we touched upon in the graph that I showed you, it is really important to understand that the longer problems are not solved, we have the fewer solutions at hand, and every solution that is ahead of us becomes more and more expensive. It looks something like this. So we have an issue, and if we are not dealing with that issue, if we do not recognize the issue early enough, or a potential issue that can emerge and grow into a crisis situation, with time, we do not have choices, or the choices become fewer, and our costs in resolving the situation become much higher. I'm sure you can think of examples where this works in practice from your past experiences in everyday situations. I'd like to share with you one from the recent Croatian past. So Croatia has experienced, starting in 2017, a bankruptcy, a breakdown of a major company, the #1 private employer, not only in Croatia, but in 3 other regional countries, employing more than, at that time, I think more than 57,000 people. The bankruptcy of this company, Agrokor, had the spillover effects on the economies of the whole region. The owner of Agrokor, when issues started emerging within the company, in the beginning had a lot of choices, the owner and the management. But as time passed, the choices became fewer, and the costs to handle them became much, much higher, resulting, unfortunately, in the owner losing his ownership and the company breaking down in a really ugly situation. So we can also learn from examples and mistakes of others, and we can try not to repeat them in our experiences. This is really a common sense advice, but an important one to remember. And the fact is that the common sense and the calm head are always very helpful, especially in a crisis situation. When the pandemic broke out, we've seen empty shelves all over the place. In major retail chains in all countries faced situations where they just couldn't fill up the shelves fast enough for the consumer demand. And this also, what it did, it created this false impression that there are shortages of certain goods, where in reality there were no shortages. There were not enough hands available in most situations to fill up the shelves fast enough. The managers of the companies really needed to keep calm and to stay level-headed, to be able to communicate to their consumers that there is enough of all goods that they need available for everybody. They just need to be patient a little bit, because the shelves will be filled overnight and the next morning the goods will be available. So common sense and the calm head and communicating well with your consumers will help you live through most crisis situations. So going back to the example that I started, this very brief overview of major lessons learned from major crisis situations in practice, going back to the example, what our client did when their lab technician tested positive on COVID, they were ready for it. So this happened in late May. And in March, when the situation in Croatia started to worsen, and when we had our first case of COVID-19 recorded in the country, most health institutions realized that sooner or later this will hit them as well, and they pumped up their protocols, and they were ready. They were ready with lists for internal communications. They were ready with internal communication channels, and they were able to communicate to all their staff, 150 plus people, immediately what is happening. They were able to send them home. They reached out to the patients who were supposed to come next day for a checkup and canceled that calmly. They got ready for the external questions. They had a holding statement in place and started working on a Q&A document the same morning. And actually, by applying all this learning about recognizing an issue early enough and getting ready for that and staying calm throughout the situation, they managed to handle it with very little negative consequences at the end.